Final Fantasy XVI is doing some radically different things with the FF series. Some things that people are absolutely mauling about, such as going back to a more medieval high fantasy direction, and in particular making use of action combat rather than being a turn-based game. These are all things that have me personally very excited. And today we're going to be talking about one of the more underrated features of Final Fantasy XVI that not too many people are talking about, as they are taking an incredibly well-received feature from Final Fantasy VII Remake and making it that much better. You're gonna want to hit the subscribe button for all things Final Fantasy XVI, as this channel goes out and seeks every bit of news and delivers it to you as soon as it happens. With that being said, one of the biggest gameplay criticisms you can make of Final Fantasy as a series is that the games are mostly easy. People talk a lot about the strategic turn-based days of old, but that's not quite how I remember it. In fact, if you go back and play these earlier games, a lot of times you can just spam your most powerful attacks. Bosses maybe have one or two mechanics that you have to watch out for, but usually you can think about how to get around that fairly easy. I know that's an incredibly hot take, but I feel it's kind of true. The real challenge of the game came from the super bosses, and anything else that you couldn't overcome, you could pretty much run around in a circle, grind out enemies, and then eventually get strong enough to one-shot God. Because of that, Final Fantasy isn't really a series that you traditionally associate with challenge. And I think that's unfortunate because I would love a harder, more difficult series of Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy games aren't really used to having a hard mode either. Even Final Fantasy 15 only had easy and normal, with Final Fantasy VII Remake being the first major Final Fantasy game to actually introduce a proper hard mode. And it was excellent, and also gives FF7R a ton of replayability value. You're waiting like 5 years for these games to release, so it's really nice when there's an extra mode there to challenge you and give you a good reason to play through the game all over again and get more hours out of it. It also allows you to enjoy those systems in a way that you weren't able to before. Well, Final Fantasy XVI also has a new game plus hard mode, and it's called Final Fantasy Mode, which again is just a brilliant name for this mode. But something that's gone overlooked in the interviews is what exactly goes on in this mode. It's actually not just the same game again but harder, and Yoshi P has something interesting to say about it. Quote, "We also have a higher difficulty mode called the Final Fantasy mode, which increases the difficulty of the game but also changes enemy placement and brings in high-level enemies into the early game to further challenge players. Again, using data that they've carried over from completing the game once. On top of that, we have other modes as well. The game is broken up into stages, and we have a mode where you can go back and replay stages in what we call arcade mode. We'll have global leaderboards so you can see how you stack up to players across the world." He then continues in saying, quote, "We didn't want to put monsters in the Final Fantasy mode that wouldn't be accessible to players outside of that difficulty setting. When I say difficulty, I don't just mean the difficulty of the monsters that you face. It's monster placement and late game enemies showing up in early game. It feels different and unique. It's not just the same mode ramped up in difficulty. It's a mixture of these different things. It's not that there are any original bosses. The game will feel completely different the second time through. You'll have to use certain techniques to beat the bosses, and it'll be much more challenging." So Final Fantasy XVI's Final Fantasy mode is more than just playing the game again on a harder difficulty, where all the enemies have more HP or deal more damage or anything like that. This is a legitimate change in difficulty, by actually changing combat scenarios and the different types of enemies that you'll be facing. This means that your second go around with FF16 is gonna feel pretty fresh. The enemy that you thought would be around the corner is not the same enemy. It's rare to see combat scenarios differ too greatly in harder difficulties, but in FF16 they are giving you all the reason in the world to play this game twice. Take your abilities and all the things that you've learned from the first playthrough, both in terms of mechanical skill and literally taking your weapons, levels, and etc. over through a new game plus. Even more cool, I think, is having leaderboards. You're gonna be able to legitimately say, "I am the best at Final Fantasy XVI." This means that even long after you platinum the game, you can still find challenge in it, pushing yourself to climb the leaderboards and get even better at the game's boss fights. This is something that really excites me about this game and is going to allow me to play this game that I've been waiting 3 years for, more than just one time, and in more than just one way. But let me know in the comment if you're excited for Final Fantasy mode. Shout out to patron Prince Darkly and the rest of the Ultima community.